West Valley City, Utah, a small suburban neighborhood framed by snow-capped mountains where life seemed predictable and safe. Susan Powell loved her home, her community, and most of all, her family. On the surface, she and her husband, Josh Powell, appeared to have everything: a happy marriage and two beautiful boys, Charlie and Braden. But as the world outside stayed serene, inside their home, cracks were beginning to show. Susan stood at the kitchen counter, packing lunches for her boys. The kitchen smelled of freshly brewed coffee, the kind of comforting aroma that made the house feel like a haven. Josh sat at the dining table, scrolling through his laptop, barely glancing at her. The boys played nearby, giggling as they chased each other around the living room. To any outsider, it would seem like a scene from a picture-perfect family, but Susan's smile faltered as she stole a glance at Josh, her hands shaking ever so slightly as she zipped the lunch bags. "Mommy, look!" Charlie shouted, holding up a crayon drawing of their family. Susan crouched to meet his eyes. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, though her voice was tinged with something that felt almost like sadness. The figure of Josh in Charlie's drawing loomed larger than the others, his face an ominous scribble of dark lines. She kissed his forehead and sent him off to play, her thoughts turning inward. Susan's journal had become her confidant, a place to express fears she couldn't voice aloud. "Josh scares me sometimes," she had written weeks earlier. "He doesn't yell or hit, but his silence is worse. It's suffocating." Their marriage hadn't always been this way. When they first met, Josh had been charming, attentive, full of big dreams about building a life together. But over the years, his behavior changed. He grew controlling, monitoring her every move. Their arguments escalated over finances, his erratic spending habits piling up debts faster than Susan could manage. And then there was his temper, a simmering rage that never boiled over, but was always there, lurking beneath the surface. That evening, Susan's best friend Emily stopped by. Emily had known Susan since high school and had watched the light dim in her friend's eyes over the years. "Are you okay?" Emily asked, leaning against the kitchen counter. Susan hesitated, glancing toward the living room where Josh sat glued to his computer. His presence felt like a shadow even in silence. "It's just things with Josh," she admitted, lowering her voice. "He's been acting off, more distant. I don't know what to do anymore." Emily frowned, her worry evident. "You've got to tell someone if you're feeling unsafe, Susan. Promise me you'll talk to someone." Susan nodded, but there was hesitation in her eyes. She wanted to believe things could change, that Josh could be the man she married again. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. Her thoughts drifted to the boys, her biggest reason for holding on. She couldn't bear the idea of breaking their world apart. As the evening wore on, the house grew quiet. Susan sat alone at the dining table, her journal open before her. She wrote in deliberate strokes, her words heavy with foreboding. "If something happens to me," she penned, her hand trembling slightly, "it won't be an accident." Josh entered the room, his footsteps soft but deliberate. Susan quickly closed the journal and forced a smile. "Just making notes for tomorrow," she said lightly. But Josh's eyes lingered on the journal for a moment too long before he turned away without a word. The next morning, the routine resumed as if nothing had happened. Josh left early with barely a goodbye. Susan watched him drive away, her heart heavy. She turned her focus to the boys, deciding to take them to the park later. She needed a moment of joy, a moment to remind herself of the good that still existed in her life. Yet an unshakable feeling of dread settled over her. Something felt wrong. The snowstorm rolled in quietly that Sunday evening, blanketing the streets of West Valley City in a sheet of white. Inside the Powell home, the air carried an unusual tension. Susan prepared dinner while Josh announced an abrupt plan. He was taking the boys on a late-night camping trip. "Camping? In this weather?" Susan questioned, her voice laced with incredulity. She glanced at the frost-coated windows, the temperature outside plunging well below freezing. Josh barely looked up as he packed the boys' coats in a small cooler. "They'll love it," Josh said curtly. "A little adventure." Susan didn't push further, though a knot of worry tightened in her chest. She stayed home that night, claiming exhaustion. Her plan was to rest, maybe catch up on journaling or call her parents. But when Josh and the boys left, something about the way he closed the door felt final. By Monday morning, the house was eerily quiet. Susan was gone. Neighbors noticed the absence immediately. She never arrived at work, and her phone calls went unanswered, a behavior so out of character that her co-workers alerted the police. Josh returned later that day with Charlie and Braden in tow. His demeanor was oddly casual, as though nothing had happened. When questioned by officers, he provided an explanation that raised more questions than it answered. "We went camping," Josh said, his tone defensive. "I didn't notice anything unusual when we got back." "But Susan isn't here," the officer pressed. Josh shrugged, the weight of his wife's disappearance seemingly lost on him. "Maybe she left. I don't know." The investigators' suspicions deepened. Searching the house, they found damp carpets and a fan running, blowing air across the living room. The air carried a faint, sharp odor: bleach. One officer knelt to inspect a patch of carpet, his gloves turning wet as he pressed down. "This was cleaned recently," he muttered, exchanging a grim look with his partner. In the kitchen, a more chilling discovery. Susan's purse and keys were untouched on the counter, her phone buried in the cushions of the living room couch. It didn't add up. If she'd left willingly, why would she abandon the essentials? By late afternoon, the Powell home was taped off, and officers had begun canvassing the neighborhood. It was a neighbor, Karen, who offered the first glimmer of insight. "Josh was cleaning his garage early this morning," Karen recalled. "It was strange. He had all the doors open, fans blowing, almost like he was trying to air something out." The words sent a shiver through the lead investigator. Back at the station, they combed through Susan's past for any signs of trouble, and the picture that emerged was troubling. Financial stress, a controlling husband, cryptic notes in her journal. The final entry read, "I love my boys. If something happens, please protect them." The investigation took a darker turn when Charlie, just 4 years old, spoke to a child psychologist. His words were innocent, but the implications were haunting. "Mommy was in the trunk," he said softly, coloring a picture of a car. The psychologist leaned closer. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Charlie pointed to his drawing. "Daddy said she stayed there while we went camping." The psychologist's blood ran cold. Though the boy's story was fragmented, his words introduced a sinister new layer to Susan's disappearance. Later that evening, Josh was called back to the station for further questioning. His responses were curt, bordering on hostile. "Why aren't you looking for her?" he snapped. "I'm not a suspect. You're wasting time on me when she could be anywhere." The officer leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "We're following every lead, Mr. Powell, but right now your behavior isn't helping your case." Josh stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "I need to take care of my kid," he said, storming out. As the sun set on West Valley City, search parties combed the desert where Josh claimed they'd camped. The vast emptiness stretched on for miles, and though they worked tirelessly into the night, there was no trace of Susan. Back at the Powell home, officers secured evidence: carpet samples, cleaning supplies, and Josh's computer. It was clear that something terrible had happened. But with no body and no direct evidence, the case remained maddeningly incomplete. The next morning, as Susan's face began to appear on missing person posters across town, her parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, stood before the cameras. Their voices cracked with grief. "She would never leave her boys," Judy said tearfully. "If anyone knows anything, please help us bring her home." The Cox family home was never meant to feel empty. Yet since Susan's disappearance, the silence inside seemed deafening. Her parents, Chuck and Judy, clung to hope, but each passing day without answers weighed heavily on their hearts. Susan's absence wasn't just a void, it was an open wound. On the third morning, Judy sat at the kitchen table, staring at Susan's favorite mug still resting by the sink. "She wouldn't just leave," Judy whispered, her voice trembling. "Not like this. Not without telling us." Chuck placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to steady her. "We'll find her," he said, though even he was beginning to doubt the words. The Powell family had provided no solace. Josh's indifference was palpable. His behavior raised more red flags with every interaction. Yet the police seemed hesitant to act decisively, constrained by the lack of concrete evidence. That week, a vigil was held in the community park. Neighbors, co-workers, and even strangers gathered to light candles and share memories of Susan. As the Cox family stood at the front, Chuck took a deep breath and stepped forward to address the crowd. "My daughter," he began, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions, "is a loving mother, a devoted wife, and a kind soul. She wouldn't just walk away from her boys. If anyone knows anything at all, please come forward." Tears welled in Judy's eyes as the crowd echoed his sentiment. The vigil ended with a moment of silence, the flickering candlelight reflecting the collective hope that Susan would come home. But the Powell household told a different story. Inside, Josh remained defiant, refusing to cooperate with investigators. When detectives arrived to retrieve further evidence, Josh stood stiffly in the doorway, arms crossed. "Why are you still here?" he snapped. "I told you everything I know." The lead investigator, a composed woman named Detective Harper, didn't flinch. "This isn't about you, Mr. Powell. It's about finding Susan, and we won't stop until we do." Inside the house, police collected items from the living room and garage. Among them was a notebook containing a list of household tasks. Written in bold at the top, "Clean the carpets." Meanwhile, disturbing details continued to surface. Susan's best friend Emily came forward with her fears. "She told me she was scared," Emily confessed to reporters. "She said Josh had been acting off. She even joked that if anything happened to her, we'd know who to blame. I didn't think it was serious at the time, but now..." Her voice trailed off as tears streamed down her face. Josh's response to these allegations was defensive and cold. Appearing on a local news broadcast, he avoided eye contact with the camera. "My wife wasn't happy," he admitted, "but that doesn't mean I did anything to her. Why isn't anyone asking where she went?" Public reaction to his interview was swift and scathing. Comments poured in online, accusing Josh of hiding the truth. The Cox family, too, watched in disbelief. "Doesn't he care?" Judy asked, her voice breaking. "How can he just sit there like that?" Amid the mounting tension, the police received a lead that sent them back to the Utah desert. Search teams combed the area Josh had claimed as their camping spot, looking for any sign of Susan. What they found instead was a shallow fire pit containing burned fabric and remnants of metal believed to be jewelry. Though inconclusive, the discovery only fueled suspicions further. Back at the station, Detective Harper reviewed the evidence again, a growing frustration gnawing at her. "We're missing something," she muttered, running her hand through her hair. "There's a piece we haven't found yet." But time was slipping away. The longer Susan remained missing, the harder it became to believe she would be found alive. That night, Chuck sat alone in his living room, surrounded by photos of Susan. He traced the edges of a framed picture of her smiling with Charlie and Braden, his hands trembling. "We'll find you," he whispered into the silence. "I promise we'll bring you home." The Powell family seemed to harbor secrets that reached far beyond Susan's disappearance. As investigators pressed deeper, they unearthed connections that would twist the narrative into something even darker. Josh's behavior became increasingly erratic. Shortly after the vigil, he packed up his sons and moved to his father's home in Washington State, severing ties with the Cox family. The move was abrupt, raising suspicions that he was trying to distance himself from the investigation. But it was in Washington where the story took a more sinister turn. Detectives, working tirelessly to trace Susan's last moments, began digging into Josh's family dynamics. Steve Powell, Josh's father, quickly became a person of interest. Described as domineering and eccentric, Steve had a history of unsettling behavior. He often involved himself in Josh and Susan's marriage, crossing boundaries that made Susan deeply uncomfortable. Her friends recounted how she tried to avoid being alone with him. Emily, Susan's best friend, described an incident at a family barbecue. "Steve cornered her in the kitchen," Emily recalled. "She told me he said something disgusting about how beautiful she was and how Josh didn't appreciate her." Susan was mortified. When detectives executed a search warrant at Steve's home, the evidence they uncovered was shocking. Hundreds of voyeuristic photos and videos of Susan were found, many taken without her knowledge. Steve had collected journals detailing his obsessive feelings for his daughter-in-law, describing her as alluring and magnetic. In one entry he wrote, "Susan knew how I felt. She must have felt it too." There was something between us, something real. The public reaction was immediate and visceral. News of Steve's obsession with Susan ignited a media frenzy, painting the Powell family in an even more disturbing light. When questioned, Steve was unapologetic. "I love Susan," he told reporters during a brief statement outside his home. "She was special, and she knew that. This investigation is nothing but a witch hunt." Josh, however, remained silent on the matter. He continued to isolate himself and his sons, denying requests for interviews and refusing further cooperation with the police. Charlie and Braden, once lively and outgoing, became withdrawn. Teachers noticed changes in Charlie's behavior, particularly in his artwork. One drawing given to his counselor depicted a car with a figure locked in the trunk, a chilling reflection of his fragmented memories. Despite mounting suspicions, authorities struggled to tie the evidence to Susan's disappearance. The lack of a body, combined with Josh's stonewalling, created a frustrating impasse. But the investigation into Steve yielded immediate consequences. He was arrested and charged with multiple counts of voyeurism and possession of illicit materials. Josh's response to his father's arrest was cold and calculated. "This has nothing to do with my family," he stated during a brief court appearance. "I'm focused on protecting my boys and moving on." But moving on seemed impossible. With every revelation, the pressure on Josh intensified. Detectives began piecing together his movements in the days after Susan vanished. A suspicious rental car logged over 800 miles within a 24-hour period. Miles Josh couldn't account for during questioning. Searches along the vehicle's route revealed burnt remnants of clothing and a metal clasp, possibly from a piece of jewelry. While inconclusive, the discovery added another layer to the growing mystery. The Cox family, devastated by the lack of progress, remained vocal. Chuck Cox called for more aggressive action. "How much more evidence do we need?" he demanded during a press conference. "My daughter is gone. My grandsons are in danger. What will it take for justice to be served?" Behind closed doors, Josh began unraveling. His isolated behavior and refusal to cooperate made him increasingly volatile. His emails to friends revealed his paranoia. "Everyone thinks I'm guilty," he wrote in one message. "They've already decided I'm a murderer, but they don't know the whole story." The cracks in Josh's facade widened as investigators continued their relentless pursuit. Detective Harper, reviewing the files late one night, paused on a photo of Susan. "We're missing something," she murmured, her voice heavy with determination. "This family is a web of lies. We just need the right thread to pull." As the days turned to weeks, the case against Josh and his family grew darker, but answers remained elusive. Susan's name was on everyone's lips, yet her fate was still a haunting question mark. The air in Graham, Washington, was heavy with unease. Josh Powell's move to his father's house wasn't just about proximity to family. It was a retreat, a fortress he was determined to build against the growing tide of suspicion. Isolated from the Cox family and surrounded by Steve Powell's distorted reality, Josh began to tighten his grip on Charlie and Braden, asserting control in increasingly disturbing ways. Teachers at the boys' new school noticed subtle changes. Once vibrant and talkative, Charlie now seemed withdrawn. During a class art project, he drew a haunting image, a car with a figure lying in the trunk, surrounded by dark, chaotic lines. His teacher gently asked him about the drawing, but Charlie's response was chilling. "That's where Daddy said Mommy was," he murmured, his small voice carrying the weight of a terrible truth. The school immediately reported the incident to Child Protective Services, and the Cox family was notified. Chuck and Judy Cox were beside themselves with worry. "He's poisoning their minds," Judy said during a meeting with their attorney. "Those boys need to be with us, where they're safe." Meanwhile, Josh's behavior grew more erratic. He refused to cooperate with child welfare agents and became increasingly aggressive during supervised visits. Caseworkers reported instances where Josh openly criticized the Cox family in front of Charlie and Braden, planting seeds of distrust in their young minds. "They don't care about you like I do," he whispered to Charlie during one session, his tone insidious and calculated. But it wasn't just the emotional manipulation that raised red flags. Josh's actions became more alarming. Detectives monitoring his activity noted frequent purchases of gas cans, tarps, and storage bins, items that could easily be used to dispose of evidence. His internet search history revealed a troubling pattern. including queries about untraceable poisons and remote locations in Utah. The Cox family's attorney filed for emergency custody, presenting this evidence to the court. However, the judge hesitated, citing a lack of concrete proof that the boys were in immediate danger. The decision devastated Chuck and Judy, but they refused to give up. "Every day they spend with him is another day they're at risk," Chuck said, his voice cracking with emotion. "We can't lose them, too." Behind closed doors, Josh continued to unravel. He sent increasingly paranoid emails to friends and colleagues, accusing the Cox family, the police, and even the media of conspiring against him. "Everyone thinks they know the truth," one email read, "but they're all wrong. I'm the victim here, not Susan." In a desperate bid to regain control, Josh requested unsupervised visitation rights, arguing that the boys needed stability. The court denied his request, citing his lack of cooperation and Steve Powell's arrest for voyeurism and possession of illicit materials. The decision was a blow to Josh, and his frustration boiled over during a supervised visit that ended in chaos. When the caseworker asked Charlie about his recent drawings, Josh slammed his hand on the table. "Stop asking him questions. He doesn't know anything," he shouted, pulling the boys close as if shielding them from invisible enemies. The caseworker filed an urgent report, recommending further restrictions on Josh's visitation rights. But it was clear that Josh was a man teetering on the edge. His actions were becoming more desperate, his movements more calculated, and the people around him could feel the storm brewing. The final straw came when a hiker discovered a pair of earrings resembling those Susan often wore. Found near a remote canyon in Utah, the discovery reignited the investigation, prompting new searches in areas Josh had visited shortly after Susan's disappearance. Though inconclusive, the find added another layer of tension to an already volatile situation. Detective Harper, reviewing the mounting evidence, felt the walls closing in on Josh. "He's planning something," she said to her team. "We need to act before it's too late." Back in Washington, Josh sat alone in his father's house, staring at a framed photo of Susan with their boys. His fingers tightened around the frame until the glass cracked. "You're not taking them from me," he muttered, his voice low and venomous. The room fell silent, the sound of shattering glass lingering in the air. The air was bitterly cold that Sunday morning as Elizabeth Griffin Hall pulled up to Josh Powell's rented home in Graham, Washington. She was there for another supervised visit with Charlie and Braden, part of the court-mandated arrangement following a string of alarming reports about Josh's behavior. Despite the growing unease surrounding these visits, Elizabeth carried out her duties with a calm professionalism, greeting the boys warmly as they exited her car. Charlie, now 7, seemed unusually quiet. Braden, only 5, clung to his brother's hand as they approached the front door. Josh was already waiting, his expression unreadable as he opened the door just enough for the boys to slip inside. Elizabeth began to follow, but before she could step through, Josh slammed the door shut, locking her out. "Josh, open the door!" Elizabeth yelled, pounding against the wood. Inside, she could hear the faint shuffle of footsteps and the unmistakable click of a lock sliding into place. Her stomach dropped. Moments later, the acrid smell of gasoline reached her nose. Elizabeth scrambled for her phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. "This is an emergency," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm at a supervised visitation with Josh Powell, and he's locked me out of the house. I can smell gasoline. Something's very wrong." As she spoke, her eyes darted toward the windows. Shadows flickered against the curtains, distorted and frantic. She could hear faint voices, Charlie and Braden, followed by Josh's low, menacing tone. Then silence. Inside the house, the scene was nothing short of a nightmare. Josh moved with chilling precision, his movements deliberate as he carried out a plan meticulously crafted in the dark corners of his mind. The boys barely had time to react as Josh grabbed a hatchet, striking them in an unspeakable act of violence. Blood pooled on the floor as he moved to the next phase of his plan. Josh doused the house in gasoline, the pungent liquid soaking into the carpet and walls. He paused for a moment, staring at a photo of Susan and the boys that still hung on the living room wall. His face twisted, a cocktail of anger and despair bubbling to the surface. "It's all your fault," he muttered under his breath, directing his venom at the absent image of Susan. Outside, Elizabeth's panic grew as the smell of gasoline thickened in the air. "You need to hurry," she urged the dispatcher, her voice breaking. "There are 2 little boys inside, please." And then the explosion. The house erupted in a deafening roar, flames shooting into the sky as shattered glass rained onto the frozen ground. The force of the blast knocked Elizabeth backward, her ears ringing as she stared in horror at the inferno consuming the home. Firefighters and police arrived within minutes, but it was already too late. The house was an unrecognizable shell, the fire so intense that it took hours to extinguish. When investigators finally entered the charred remains, they found the bodies of Josh, Charlie, and Braden. The autopsy reports were as heartbreaking as they were horrifying. The boys had been alive when the fire started, but their injuries from the hatchet confirmed that Josh's final act had been one of unspeakable cruelty. His intent was clear: control, even in death. News of the tragedy spread like wildfire. Vigils sprang up in cities across the state, candles flickering in the icy wind as communities mourned the loss of 2 innocent lives. Reporters swarmed the Cox family home, their cameras capturing the raw grief etched into Chuck and Judy's faces as they tried to process the unimaginable. "We trusted the system to protect them," Chuck said, his voice trembling with anger and sorrow. "And it failed." The investigation into Josh's actions revealed a chilling premeditation. Emails sent just hours before the fire contained messages to his attorney and family members, detailing his plans and placing blame on everyone but himself. "I've been destroyed by lies," one email read. "This is the only way to set things right." But there was no righting the wrongs Josh had committed. His final act left a void that would never be filled, a scar that would never heal. As the flames subsided and the ashes cooled, the Powell family's story reached its devastating conclusion. Yet for those left behind, the pain was far from over. The fire may have reduced the Powell home to ashes, but the questions surrounding Susan Powell's disappearance still smoldered, leaving a trail of anguish and doubt. For Chuck and Judy Cox, closure remained elusive, the mystery of their daughter's fate lingering like a ghost. In the weeks following the tragedy, investigators retraced Josh Powell's movements in the days leading up to Susan's disappearance. Their search led to the Utah desert, vast and unyielding, where Josh had claimed to camp with his boys. This time, searchers focused on areas previously overlooked, remote mines and canyons with reputations for their treacherous terrain. One particular shaft drew attention when cadaver dogs signaled repeatedly near its entrance. Hopes rose as the search team descended, but the pit revealed nothing more than debris and silence. "It's like she vanished into thin air," one investigator said, his voice heavy with frustration. Meanwhile, digital forensics unearthed unsettling details about Josh's state of mind. His internet history painted a chilling portrait of premeditation. Among the searches, how to hide a body, how to destroy DNA, and specific inquiries about abandoned mines in Utah. Emails sent to co-workers hinted at his dark intentions. "Sometimes you have to start over," one read. "Some things are better left buried." One break in the case came from a former co-worker of Josh's, who recounted a peculiar conversation. "He asked me how to dispose of something large, something nobody would ever find," the co-worker said. "At the time, I thought he was joking. Now, I'm not so sure." These revelations reignited efforts to uncover Susan's remains. The Cox family pleaded with authorities to expand the search, but the enormity of the desert and the lack of concrete leads made progress painfully slow. As weeks turned into months, hope began to wane. In their own desperate pursuit of answers, Chuck and Judy launched a foundation in Susan's name, advocating for victims of domestic violence and missing persons. Their message was clear: Susan's story would not be forgotten. "We couldn't save her," Judy said during a televised interview, tears streaming down her face. "But maybe we can save someone else." Public interest in the case surged after a new lead emerged. A hiker discovered a set of earrings near a remote canyon that resembled ones Susan had often worn. Investigators raced to the scene, scouring the area for additional clues, but once again, their search came up empty. The earrings, though compelling, provided no definitive link to Susan. As the anniversary of her disappearance approached, vigils were held in Susan's honor. At one gathering, Chuck spoke to a somber crowd holding candles against the night's chill. "We won't stop searching," he said, his voice resolute. Susan deserves to be found. Yet for all the efforts, Susan's fate remained a haunting enigma. Josh Powell had taken many secrets to his grave, leaving behind a void filled with questions and pain. Detectives continued to pore over files, searching for missed details, but each passing day made the truth feel more distant. The weight of the mystery took its toll on everyone involved. Investigators wrestled with their inability to provide closure. Friends and family clung to fading memories, their lives overshadowed by the unanswered question: where was Susan Powell? For Chuck and Judy, every sunrise was a reminder of their loss, but also of their determination. "We'll never give up," Chuck said quietly one morning as he gazed at a photo of Susan. Never. The case of Susan Powell remained open, a stark testament to the complexities of justice and the enduring power of hope. And though the trail had gone cold, the world continued to watch, waiting for the day when her story would finally reach its end. The years that followed the Powell tragedy were marked by grief, anger, and an unrelenting quest for answers. For Chuck and Judy Cox, every day was a reminder of the unimaginable loss they had endured. Their daughter was still missing, their grandsons taken in a moment of horrific violence. Yet amidst the heartache, they found purpose. In the wake of the tragedy, the Cox family established the Susan Cox Powell Foundation, dedicated to raising awareness about domestic violence and advocating for systemic change. "We couldn't save Susan," Judy said during the foundation's launch event, her voice steady but strained. "But we can save others. Her story isn't just about loss, it's about hope." The foundation quickly became a beacon for survivors and their families, offering resources, support, and a platform to share their stories. Public interest in the case surged once again as the media spotlight shifted to the broader issues of domestic abuse and child protection. Chuck often appeared at events, his demeanor a mix of quiet strength and unyielding determination. "Our daughter's story doesn't end with Josh Powell," he said during a televised interview. "It ends with the lives we save by sharing her truth." But for all their work, the mystery of Susan's disappearance remained an open wound. Investigators continued to receive tips and leads, though many proved fruitless. One promising development came when a search team uncovered what appeared to be bone fragments in a remote canyon, a location Josh had been known to frequent. Forensic testing revealed the fragments were not human, a devastating blow to the Cox family and the detectives who had poured countless hours into the case. Even so, the search efforts persisted. The Utah desert became a grim symbol of the unanswered question that haunted everyone who had followed the story. Where was Susan? Meanwhile, the legacy of Josh Powell's actions reverberated far beyond his immediate circle. The case became a catalyst for significant changes in family law, particularly regarding custody arrangements in cases involving domestic violence allegations. Advocacy groups cited the Powell tragedy as a glaring example of systemic failure, emphasizing the need for stricter safeguards to protect children. At a legislative hearing, Judy testified, her voice breaking as she recounted the events that led to the loss of Charlie and Braden. "The system that was supposed to protect them gave them back to a monster," she said. "That cannot happen again." The laws passed in the aftermath of her testimony bore Susan's name, a bittersweet victory that underscored the duality of her legacy. While her absence continued to be a source of pain, her story had sparked meaningful change. Amid these developments, a hiker discovered a piece of jewelry near the edge of an isolated ravine. It was a simple gold ring, weathered and tarnished, but eerily similar to the one Susan was known to wear. Investigators combed the area, their hopes reignited, but once again, the search yielded no definitive answers. The ring was inconclusive, a tantalizing clue that ultimately led nowhere. For the Cox family, the discovery was both a glimmer of hope and a painful reminder of their unresolved grief. "It's like she's just out of reach," Chuck said quietly during a press conference. "We keep getting so close, but never close enough." Despite the lack of closure, Susan's story continued to resonate. Her face became a symbol of resilience, her name a rallying cry for justice. Vigils were held on the anniversary of her disappearance, the glow of candles illuminating the faces of those who refused to let her memory fade. One such vigil took place outside the Cox family home, where friends, neighbors, and strangers gathered to share stories about Susan. Judy stood at the front, clutching a photo of her daughter and grandsons. "We'll never stop looking," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Not until we bring her home." As the crowd bowed their heads in silence, the flickering flames seemed to carry an unspoken promise that Susan's light, though dimmed, would never be extinguished. In the years that followed, the Powell case remained a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked abuse and the devastating consequences of inaction. Yet it was also a testament to the enduring power of love and the unyielding strength of those left behind. Chuck and Judy's fight for justice became a legacy in its own right, a beacon for others navigating the darkness of loss. And though the answers they sought remained elusive, one truth was undeniable. Susan Powell's story had changed the world. What do you think of Josh Powell and the tragic story of the Powell family? From which region are you watching this video? Share your thoughts in the comments below and rate this story from 0 to 10. We'd love to hear your perspective.